Mr. Ricardo's history class was as predictable as a train on rails. Facts, dates, names, all in a straight line and monotonous. For 15-year-old David, history wasn't a line. It was a spider web, with threads connecting everything to all other subjects. "Teacher," he interrupted, his hand raised in the air, "isn't the Roman Empire's crisis with metals economically similar to the oil crisis in the 1970s? Mr. Ricardo sighed, his patience wearing thin. "Focus on the topic, David." 5 minutes. Later, David tried again. "But wasn't the logistics of the Roman legions the basis for the modern military logistics we saw in geography?" The vein in the professor's forehead throbbed. He stopped the class, slammed the book on the table, and pointed his finger at the boy. "David, shut up. For the last time, no more interruptions. You're disrupting the entire class." The silence in the room was heavy, cutting. David's face, once full of curiosity, closed into a mask of humiliation. At that exact moment, the classroom door opened softly. The school principal, pale and sweating, held the door for a woman with an upright posture and a penetrating gaze. Mr. Ricardo froze. He recognized her from the news. It was Dr. Helena Montero, the country's new and feared Minister of Education. "Hello. Which city are you watching us from right now? We love to know how far our stories reach. If you want to know what happened after the most powerful woman in education in the country witnessed this scene, and how the humiliation of one student became the spark for a revolution, stay tuned. Subscribe to the channel, because you won't want to miss a word of what comes next. To understand the weight of that 'shut up,' you need to know about the struggle of Sophia, David's mother. This is her outburst, a battle fought in meeting rooms with vague-looking coordinators. Ever since David was little, Sophia knew that his mind was different. He didn't see subjects. He saw systems. His notebooks weren't filled with linear notes, but with complex mind maps, arrows connecting the French Revolution to quantum physics, Shakespeare's poetry to mathematics. He didn't interrupt to be rude. He interrupted because his mind made connections faster than the class could keep up. Sophia tried to explain this countless times. "He's not being disrespectful. He's engaged on a deeper level," she would say, spreading David's drawings and diagrams across the table. The response was always the same. A condescending smile and pedagogical jargon. "We understand, Mrs. Sophia, but he needs to learn to respect the structure of the class. He needs to develop self-control." She felt like a translator of a language no one wanted to learn. She saw the light in her son's eyes fading every day he came home from school. Every time they told her that his greatest strength, his insatiable curiosity, was actually a behavior problem. Her fight was not for higher grades, but for the survival of her son's spirit. The school, of course, claimed to promote inclusion, but their version of inclusion was a series of failed attempts to make David fit into the mold. The first solution was a behavioral intervention plan. In practice, it was a chart on the wall where David received a red X every time he interrupted. The hope was that public humiliation would teach him to be quiet. The result was that David stopped raising his hand altogether. The second attempt was to move him to the back of the classroom. The logic was out of sight, out of mind. The hope was that if he wasn't in the teacher's line of sight, he would feel less compelled to participate. It worked. David became a ghost student, quiet in his corner, but his mind, once a whirlwind of ideas, was now still. His notebooks remained empty. The false hope that these strategies would help him was, in fact, the school's desperate search for silence and conformity. They didn't want to include David. They wanted to contain his brilliant and chaotic mind because it didn't fit into their spreadsheets and lesson plans. Each solution was a new lock on his mind. The epicenter of the conflict was Mr. Ricardo's classroom. He wasn't a bad man. He was a product of the system, overworked, underpaid, and trained to value order over discovery. The curriculum was his sacred guide, and time was his enemy. David was an anomaly he didn't know how to process. David's questions were not simple. They were challenging, expansive, and, to Mr. Ricardo, threatening. They exposed the limitations of his own knowledge, which was limited to the textbook. One day, while teaching about the invention of the Gutenberg printing press, David raised his hand. "Sir, didn't the spread of information by the printing press create the same kind of social panic about fake news that the internet creates today?" The room fell silent. It was a college-level question. Mr. Ricardo, caught off guard, stammered, That's not in our material. David. He felt diminished in front of the class. To him, David's curiosity was not a gift to the class, but a personal attack on his authority. The human conflict was this: the collision between a mind that saw forests and a teacher who was only allowed to describe trees. And with each collision, the teacher's frustration grew, paving the way for the outburst that would change everything. Back to the scene. The Minister of Education, Dr. Helena Montero, is at the door. The teacher's "shut up" still echoes in the air. The principal looks like he's about to faint. Mr. Ricardo is paralyzed, his face turning from red to white. What happens next is a true demonstration of power. Dr. Montero does not address the teacher. She completely ignores the adults in the room. Her eyes are focused on a single point: the boy sitting in the middle of the room, cowering in his chair. She walks with firm, silent steps, the sound of her shoes on the linoleum floor being the only thing that breaks the silence. She stops next to David's desk. Without breaking eye contact with him, she crouches down to his level. Her voice is calm, but it carries unquestionable authority. "Hello, David," she says softly. "I heard the beginning of your question about military logistics. It sounded fascinating. Would you mind finishing?" The turn was not a shout or a punishment. It was an invitation. At that moment, in front of the entire class, the most important woman in education in the country validated the boy the teacher had just humiliated. She didn't just give him permission to speak. She showed him that his voice was the most important one in that room. Power changed hands silently, absolutely, and devastatingly. The minister's visit was the earthquake. What followed were the aftershocks that reshaped the landscape. The first victory was immediate. Dr. Montero canceled the rest of her schedule and spent the next 2 hours in that classroom. She used David's question as a starting point for an impromptu and brilliant lesson on how history, geography, and technology are connected. David, for the first time, was not the disruptor. He was the main contributor. The other students, previously bored, were on the edge of their seats, fascinated. The second victory was bureaucratic but powerful. The next day, Sophia was called to a meeting at the school. But this time, there were no condescending smiles. In the room were the principal, a visibly shaken Mr. Ricardo, and an advisor to the minister. For the first time, they didn't give Sophia a plan. They asked, "What does David need? How can we help?" Using Sophia's notes and David's notebooks as a basis, they created a pilot project for interdisciplinary learning centered on David. The most significant victory was Mr. Ricardo's transformation. He was placed in a retraining program. He returned to the classroom a different man, frightened, humble. In a class a few weeks later, David asked one of his complex questions. The old Ricardo would have gotten angry. The new Ricardo paused, thought, and said to the class, "That's an excellent question. Frankly, I don't know the answer, but let's find out together." And for the first time, Mr. Ricardo's classroom was no longer a train on rails, but a place of exploration. That night in her official car, Dr. Helena Montero looked out the window, but she didn't see the city. She saw a legion of Davids scattered across the country. Brilliant, curious minds, systematically silenced by a system that values obedience over genius. She thought of her own grandson, who was also autistic, and the struggle her daughter faced every day, a struggle identical to Sophia's. The visit had not been a coincidence. She was looking for this. She wanted to see with her own eyes the disconnect between the discourse of inclusion and the brutal reality of the classrooms. Mr. Ricardo was not the enemy, she reflected. He was a symptom of a larger disease, a disease of conformity, of fear of the unknown, of a bureaucracy that stifles passion. True educational reform, she understood more clearly than ever, would not come from new buildings or tablets. It would come from deconstructing the very idea of what a good student and a good teacher are. From that day on, her mission took on a new focus. It was no longer about policies and budgets. It was about finding and empowering the Davids and re-educating the Ricardos. It was about teaching an entire country that the most disruptive questions are often the only ones that really matter. Life at school did not become perfect overnight. The system was still cumbersome and slow, but in Mr. Ricardo's classroom, a different culture began to emerge. David's interruptions became starting points. He was encouraged to create his mind maps on the whiteboard so that everyone could see the connections he was making. The other students, instead of mocking him, began to seek him out with questions, fascinated by his way of thinking. The final scene takes place months later. Sophia is at the classroom door to pick up David. She sees him in the center of a small group of classmates, excitedly explaining how bird migration patterns can be used to understand logistics networks. Mr. Ricardo stands nearby watching, not as a jailer but as a facilitator, a conductor of an orchestra he has finally learned to listen to. He meets Sophia's gaze and nods, a gesture of mutual respect. The pain of past battles still lingered, but it was being overshadowed by a new reality. The hope was not that the world would become perfect for David, but that he now had the right to help shape it with his unique, powerful, and finally welcome voice. Brilliant minds rarely follow the script. Our job is not to silence them, but to learn to read their notes in the margins. It is in those notes that the future is often found. If this story has awakened something in you, if it has made you want a world that hears all voices, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your interaction is what allows us to continue amplifying these narratives. Someone needs to know that they are not alone in their struggle today.